Good morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Today's program is part of C by C, an idea summit presented by all the World Affairs Councils across the United States. This week, the councils from around the country are working together to highlight the power of our network. I welcome all of my fellow council members from around the country. We encourage all of those viewing today to please support your local World Affairs Council. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program focusing on America's economic inequality and historical unemployment with author Gene Sperling, former director of the National Economic Council. He will be joined by moderator Rick Wartzman, director of the K.H. Moon Center of the Drucker Institute. Please be sure to buy Gene's new book, Economic Dignity, which will be part of today's discussion. Gene and Rick, thank you both so very much for joining us. And now, Rick, it's my turn to turn it over to you for today's discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. And thanks to everyone at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall for having us here today. I think Gene will pop on here in a minute. Thanks as well to all of you for tuning in. Probably the last thing everybody wants or needs right now is another hour of online meeting time. So we're grateful for your interest and your attention. And thanks most of all to Gene, who just joined us, for writing Economic Dignity. It really is a wonderful book. I follow these issues very closely, and I found my wheels turning on pretty much every page. So as Kim said, please go out and buy the book. Makes a lovely gift as well, I can tell you. As Kim said, Gene served as director of the National Economic Council under both Presidents Clinton and Obama. He also founded the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. He's been a senior economic advisor to multiple presidential campaigns, and of particular interest in this town, he was a consultant on NBC's The West Wing for 4 seasons. And on a personal note, I'll add that I first met Gene when I was a young reporter back in the Wall Street Journal's Washington bureau. And Gene was always the best source because you could find him at all hours. He was always in his office working, so he could be counted on to pick up his phone. And he was truly the hardest working person in Washington. So as Kim said, I'm going to ask Gene questions for about 20 minutes or so, but this is really in prelude to a broader conversation with all of you. And we'll use the balance of the time, the remaining 20 minutes or so, for your questions. So please go ahead and submit those when the time comes up to do that. So Gene, let me dive in, and I guess again, congratulations on the book. It really is fantastic. I wonder if you could start by laying out your definition of economic dignity. I think we all have some notion of what dignity means, or we kind of think we know what dignity means, but you're very precise about what dignity means and what it means in an economic context. And you have 3 specific pillars that your thinking rests on. Can you lay those out for us?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would mention is that I didn't start writing this book to write a book on dignity. I started writing this book to say, for all of us who are engaged in economic policy, it's so easy to get lost in particular economic metrics, GDP to job, median wage, or as we often debate, different policy camps, or was a decision right or wrong, this, here or then. And I just found it so too easy to take your eye off the ball, which is to ask yourself at every moment, what should be the ultimate goal for economic policy, and that you shouldn't feel that it's somehow fuzzy or inappropriate to remind yourself that your ultimate goal is to ask, what on your deathbed would you think mattered most in your life economically? What matters most for happiness and human fulfillment? And I started to feel that the things that I wanted to say, that I thought we were capable as a country of providing universally to everyone, did fall into the area of dignity. And it is powerful to look at the use of the word dignity through time. It is clearly affects our values that were in many of our constitutional rights. Justice Brennan talked powerfully about it. You've seen Cesar Chavez, I think Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King mostly in the civil rights movement. Today, Joe Biden, Sherrod Brown, Cory Booker, many others. But the one thing that did hit me was that while I thought people used the word dignity correctly, it was never really a complete definition. It tended to be, as I said in the book, like the MasterCard commercial where they say, taking your child, 2 tickets to a ball game, $20, hot dog and Coke, $5, time with your dad and brothers, priceless. And that was kind of how it was. It was, you supported organizing, you supported minimum wage, you supported things. And at the end you said, and this is also about dignity. It's also about something priceless and intrinsic. And what hit me though was that if I was going to try to define an ultimate North Star, it had to be complete. It couldn't be, oh, this is one good thing. And I guess over a period of years, I came to think that there were really 3 pillars, as Rick said. One, do all of us have the capacity economically to not only care for our family, but to be there for life's most precious joys and meaningful moments? That it's not just about putting food on the table, it's about being at the table, being at the bedside, being at the bedtime story in life's most treasured moments, and that we really needed to think about that, because otherwise we could glamorize the person who is working 90 hours a week, not because they're, thrilled to be working in the White House, but they have no choice. That's not an economic dignity standard. But 2, we're not just about our goods and our services. Each of us has a desire to pursue our potential, our purpose, our meaning. And one of the things I talk about is that part of our value, however unfulfilled it was for large amounts of our country and large amounts of our populations, particularly racially, there still is this ideal that you should have a first and second chance. And we glorify second chances, though we are miserable in practice at it. And finally, and this was important, that these first 2 pillars do not work if you do not have a third pillar that says that you can work and contribute in the economy with respect and free from domination and humiliation. Indeed, a lot of what has cost people dignity, and I don't just mean in the southern West Virginia mine strikes in the early part of the century, but throughout our history and today, we see it powerfully today, is that in their desperation to fulfill the first 2 pillars of dignity, to have a career, to put food on the table, to provide for their family, that people have been forced to be subject to domination and humiliation at odds with dignity. So Rick, I felt if I was going to say this was our single North Star, economic dignity, it needed a full definition. And, I'm sure people will disagree, but I felt that it would be useful to lay out my view and to put forward a full definition of economic dignity that went beyond saying dignity of work or adding dignity at the end of a call for various different policies.
No, I love it. And I think what's great about it is, as you say, for somebody who's probably spent a lot of your career thinking about very quantitative things, these are, qualitative, but you can really grasp them. And again, in the book, you really lay them out in full and in a very thoughtful way. So Gene, of course, this has come out. I mean, the reason we're not sitting, 5 feet from one another, on a stage somewhere, is that we're in the midst of this terrible pandemic, right? A crisis that's laid bare the precarious position that so many Americans find themselves, right? Whether it's from a financial perspective or a worker voice perspective or an access to quality and affordable healthcare perspective. What stood out the most for you in this moment, this terrible moment, from through an economic dignity lens?
Well, Rick, if I had to think of what maybe is my singular favorite, most powerful speech on dignity, it's Martin Luther King's speech at the Memphis sanitation workers strike on March 18th, after 2 men in their 30s, Ecole and Robert Walker, are crushed by a truck. There's a huge sanitation worker strike, and King comes just weeks before his assassination, and he makes his famous call that all labor has dignity. But the line he says right leading up to that is that we will come as a nation to realize that both the sanitation worker and the physician are essential to our health and well-being. And I think maybe for 50 some years that might have seemed like an ideal, but I think this is that moment where we are now in a very powerful moment, sense, recognizing, yes, the person who is delivering the food, the farm worker, the home health aide, the nurse orderly, they are literally saving our lives, and they are essential, and yet we are not treating them essential. And going back to King, King says in that same speech to just recognize dignity, but not treat people economically with dignity is a fairly empty gesture. And his line is, what good is it to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you cannot afford to buy your family a meal? And in a sense, I think that there must be so many people who feel, I appreciate the applause, I appreciate being called the hero, but I can't put food on my table. 50% of home aides, nursing aides, don't have a single day of paid sick leave. 50% of farm workers don't. So, Rick, what I think is that there's both a temporary moment of truth and a long-term moment of truth. The temporary moment of truth is, at this moment, this is so visceral. Are we going to have something like an essential workers bill of rights that provides the PPE and the hazard pay? But the long-term issue we have to ask is, why don't we have a basic level of economic dignity for everyone? Why is it okay? Why was it okay yesterday, not just today, that people who care for our children, less than 1 of 10 for them, could take a week off to care for their own child? There's something deeply wrong with that when you consider that that is, in our lives, one of the most important and valuable jobs. And we regularly let these workers live without, I think, a full sense of economic dignity, however much pride they take in their work.
Yeah, one of the things I think about from that strike, right, is the famous, signs that were held up by the workers, "I am a man." And
I am a man. Yep.
other,
And people say to me sometimes, well, isn't dignity about what you feel internally? Well, those sanitation workers, they felt dignity themselves. When they said, "I am a man," they were saying, I want what you do economically to recognize that basic intrinsic humanity. And people make fun if I actually quote from Immanuel Kant, but it's so relevant to the crisis today. He says that dignity means that you never should feel that you are being treated solely as a means to another person's end. So right now, that's a huge issue, because I think people are willing to go back to work. I think there's people that are willing to work and play, not just help reopen the economy, but serve others. But if they feel like, which is probably how the workers going back in the meat processing feel, that they are just purely a means to our ends, that we're not going to protect their safety, then I think that is an assault on dignity. So how we are treating workers, how we are reopening the economy, is not just about metrics. It is about our level of dignity and respect for the intrinsic value of the people who are risking their lives for us.
So not surprisingly, coming from where you come from, you hold up a number of Democratic leaders in the book for promoting policies that have enhanced economic dignity, including your old bosses, Presidents Clinton and Obama. You have much to say about FDR's vision and worldview, but you also spend a lot of time lauding a Republican, namely Teddy Roosevelt, for his views around a certain type of economic dignity you call negative dignity. So what is that, and why is Teddy Roosevelt so important to your own thinking?
So in chapter 2 in the book, I define negative economic dignity and positive economic dignity in the way that you usually talk about liberty. Positive dignity is the affirmative things like Social Security, universal health care, universal paid sick leave that you would do. Negative dignity is more that protection that we normally thought in our country as being from government domination. And around the turn of the century, at least for the white Americans who had not already been subject to so much domination, humiliation, they realized there's very little protection at work against the kind of domination that feels at odds with what the values of the country are supposed to be. And what was so striking to me about Teddy Roosevelt, and why I wish he would be more of a model for the conservatives today, is he starts out with a very pro-market, pro-business free enterprise. And what changes is not some economic theory about consumer welfare or anything like that. He, as a New York assemblyman, goes and tours the tenements where they're making cigars. And he sees a level of degradation. He sees children, he sees adults humiliated in front of their children who are forced to work with them. And he says, this doesn't work. Unfettered capitalism must have a basic floor. And he changes his worldview based on reality. And it continues when he does his nighttime investigations as the New York City police commissioner later. And so it's powerful that he was changed by this real world experience. And what frustrates me so much is you do hear some progressives like Ben Sasse or Marco Rubio and others talk about the dignity of work. But as the civil rights expression goes, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. Why don't they? Because what dominates is their kind of ideology. The leading view is that you always have to keep government small. You always have to, and it gets to its extreme when they oppose even a higher minimum wage. I mean, think about it. If the view of the conservatives is they want to encourage work and responsibility, they don't recognize that even for people like we're seeing, these essential workers who are working, putting their lives on their line, they don't even have a degree of economic dignity. So I use Teddy Roosevelt as kind of a model of making your economic policy not on a preconceived theory, but looking at how people actually live, and whether you have a form of a market or capitalist system that has as a guarantee a level of basic economic dignity for everyone.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the things I like about the book is that you don't pull any punches, which some people in your position might have. So you take on these so-called dignity of work conservatives just pretty straight up. And you mentioned Senators Sasse and Rubio. You talk about Orrin Cass from the Manhattan Institute and Arthur Brooks from now at Harvard and the American Enterprise Institute for so long. And who you described as a friend in the book, although I'm not sure that'll be true after he reads what you have to say. Are there bits and pieces of what they say that resonate with you? And are there any, is there anyone on the, Republican side of the aisle, the conservative end of the spectrum, who you do think, yeah, they really get it? We may kind of come at it differently in terms of how to get there, but they really do get it. Or is, maybe another way to say it, is there any Teddy Roosevelt in today's world?
Well, in the end of that chapter, I write my last paragraph in it is that I write this not as a condemnation, but more as a challenge. I do think it's good to see people talking about the dignity of work and not just talking about GDP and recognizing these deeper values. And so I applaud them when they do that. And certainly Arthur Brooks has always pushed a compassionate type of conservatism. But I'm still go back to King's line, which is that, a lot of these people like to quote King. And yet, if you read King, he is so emphatic that the recognition of dignity, while important, while we want everybody to treat workers and everybody they meet with values and respect. I mean, one of the things I love to death about our nominee, Joe Biden, is every time I ever went with him anywhere, we were always a half hour late coming back because he had to go into the back room and thank everybody. And, and I want my kids to be like that, to recognize the dignity of all people and all work and their contribution. And so I do appreciate when they do that, but there is a hollowness to do that and then vote against the minimum wage, vote against pre-existing condition protections. And the line I go after a little is, and I know what they're saying that dignity is about feeling needed, that you need to be needed. And I understand what they're saying. They're trying to say that people, I think they're trying to support, in some sense, the notion of second chances in working. But it rings hollow, because what's crushing so many people is not that they're not needed, is that they know they're needed by their children. They can't provide the healthcare, the security, the housing. Right now, there are tens of millions that are fearful of that. So I am a little impatient with those who talk the talk, and every chance they get to walk the walk, they don't. Maybe when we get out of this Trump era, some of those people will start matching policies to their words. I hope.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so as well. So I think one of the things that really I think is extraordinary about the book is its depth, but its breadth as well. You really lay out an incredibly broad agenda to enhance economic dignity. Everything from the need for universal health care, and I should note at this fractious time over this, you don't endorse whether it's a Medicare for all type solution or a public option. You leave that aside, but some kind of universal health care, access for folks, what you call a UBI to rise, kind of a form of universal basic income for a period of time where dislocated workers are trying to get back on their feet. An ARPA, AI jobs initiative, really interesting, a big federal fund, right, to promote artificial intelligence that will enhance job creation and dignity of work as opposed to just replacing jobs. A massively expanded earned income tax credit, a strategy to create what you call double dignity jobs, a full employment focus at the Federal Reserve, mechanisms to bolster worker voice and power, and on and on and on. I mean, this is a really long list. If I were the president and I came to you and I said, Gene, you're back in for a third time as my director of the Economic Council, and I need your help. I loved your book, but we got to focus on one thing to start in this long list. I can't do everything. What would you tell me to lean into first, and why?
Well, I'm going to answer your question, and I'm going to cheat at the same time. I think what I would say is that the first thing is repair our social compact. And so what I'd say is have a true dignity wage. But I won't mean by that just the minimum wage. What I would mean by that is say, yes, we have to do way more for people who can't work, or people can work some, people with disabilities. We need to empower everybody to contribute in every way in their life and have dignity. But start with the view of, here is a package, perhaps a single bill, that has this dignity frame that maybe says $15 minimum wage nationally, maybe it moves up higher over time, but together with an added amount like an earned income tax credit, you're still affecting your wage, the child care and health care and paid leave. Now, I know I feel like I've just mentioned 5 or 6 things, but not really, because to a person, what they feel like is, if I'm working hard, can I raise my family with economic dignity? And I think this moment is exposing that things like not having universal paid sick leave is not like an extra or a fringe issue. We know what it's like. You can't take time off to care for your children, your parents when they're passing away. So I would have like a single package. And yes, I would focus on it even over some policy that might help bump GDP for a quarter. Not that that's not important, but the kind of pain that people suffer year after year that's unnecessary, that we don't have to allow. I think that would be a great legacy for the next president, to say that they did have a dignity wage. And by wage, I mean not just what your employer did, but what you get and can provide and care for your family by your efforts, by your contribution.
That's great. No, and I can see you cheated as a good Washington person does, but it worked. Let me ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for their questions. In the introduction to the book, you write that you've been blessed to work for leaders truly committed to economic justice, and you talk, of course, about Presidents Clinton and Obama. There'd be a bunch of folks who I think would challenge that premise from the maybe far progressive end, or so-called progressive end of the party, and your party, and they'd attack other, so-called neoliberals on the same grounds. I'm not going to ask you to defend those words. I happen to agree with them, but I would ask you, looking back, is there anything, whether around trade or whatever, that you might, now that you've really thought even more about economic dignity, a policy that you worked on that you might have approached differently or not pushed at all, based on your current thinking?
Well, I'll mention two or three things. First, I guess what I'd say is I think, of course, it's fair to go back and relitigate and debate issues. The problem is that often, the things that people did that didn't meet the values that many people now would call for, is often not because people's heart wasn't in the right place, but often because they were constrained by divided government. President Clinton had his last 6 years with all Republican control. Certain economic trends became more clear with time. So I think these debates are important, but I think what's more important is that people feel free to evolve, that you don't dig into a debate in the 90s, but maybe you can come together more now if you just say, whoever was right or wrong then or should have known something. And so I've mentioned three things that I think we've seen over the last 20 years. I believe that while at the end of the 90s, the Clinton years, you saw tremendous shared economic growth and wages for the bottom going up more than wages for the top 20%. But I think the period of globalization has really shown how harmful all of these different ways that inequality is structured. And I think, and I say in the book, with my hat off to many progressive economists who said, we need to focus not just on human capital, but on these structures, not, beyond the minimum wage and greater unionization. I think there's more awareness of the different ways that workers, even domestic workers, others, can form unions or collectively bargain, understanding the dangers of look, I think big tech is becoming a real concern, but monopoly, economic concentration. And so I think you have to incorporate much more on the power structures. Now, had we known all that, was there anything that you could do that much differently? Perhaps not, but I think it's important to recognize that the people who said that have turned out to be more and more right over time. Secondly, I think President Clinton had a very good vision about a larger economic compact, with universal health care and universal training. And I think President Obama did too. But I think there probably was a sense that you do the best you can, you can't get everything. I think that what we've seen is that certain types of change wreak such devastating harms on certain communities and people, not because it has to, but because we have such, in places, a miserable economic safety net, not just a safety net, but policy for creating jobs, investing jobs, helping communities rise. We shouldn't be against all things that could be called industrial policy when some of those are about creating a green revolution, innovation that could create jobs in the places that are lost. And I have come to feel that if we can't do that, if we can't ensure that we have a policy that is not going to create such devastating harm for some people and some communities, that it violates this sphere of dignity that should never be trampled on, then maybe we just should not go forward at all. And Rick, the last thing I'll say, which goes beyond issues, but it goes to somewhat the core of the book. I do think when you're in economics, you tend to only think of something as an economic issue when it shows up in economic metrics. So paid family leave becomes an economic issue if it's affecting the labor force participation of women. But I really want to challenge that. If 30, 40 million, 50 million people are going to work every day and they feel they're being sexually harassed or abused or mistreated, why do we have to see that in an economic metric for that to be a first-tier economic issue? And I think if we were willing to look at people's pain, regardless of how it showed up, we'd have less people invisible in our economy. I mean, the discussion about gig workers today is so important, but people should know why are we just, why did it take Uber and Instacart for us to focus on this? In 2012, when Uber X is launched, there are 2 million household workers, of which 12% have health care, 7% have any type of retirement security, and more than and that's true for more than half of taxi cab drivers. So these are the types of things that didn't fit in neatly to the metrics of wages and jobs, but they're about dignity, they're about pain, and I think they become more invisible and less invisible when you are recognizing from the start that economic dignity is your North Star.
Great. So with that, I want to invite Jessica in to help relay some of the questions from those who are watching.
Perfect.
Jessica, yeah, great.
Wonderful. Yes, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I apologize if we don't get to all of them, but our first question is, what are the costs and benefits of an open U.S. immigration policy in light of the potential for long-term job losses in the U.S. and the growing number of native U.S. citizens who will be unemployed and competing for jobs?
Well, I think that there's a lot of policies that people jam into a single policy as opposed to realizing that we have a lot of policy tools. Now, most economic studies have shown that immigration does not have the negative impacts on either the budget or the workforce that are often suggested by people who oppose immigration. On the other hand, where it does, which might be that it has some of those impacts on high school educated Americans, perhaps some people who are not don't have quite the opportunity. Your choice is not economic dignity. I mean, your choice is not immigration or not. Your choice is what kind of policies do you have. If you had a higher minimum wage, you could easily make up for any loss that someone might have. So higher minimum wage, higher EITC, more ability for people to unionize. What I do object to is when we have immigration policies that I think kind of violate our sense of kind of involuntary servitude. I think when we have people come in, you don't want them to be treated as terribly as I believe our farm workers are right now. Sheep herders, so many people are treated so poorly, both because it's inhumane and violates our sense of dignity, but also if you can treat some workers that badly, it takes away the power of other workers to make those demands. So I really think this goes to one of those issues where you shouldn't look just in isolation. You should look and say, what kind of policies do we have? But I will say the following. I do think we should have a world in which for that, while we might want to let in, more people with high skilled immigration to our country, when that is used as an excuse to not invest in our workforce, to not focus on our own workers, then I think people have a right to be upset. And I think that those things have to happen at least hand in hand.
Thank you.
Add quickly that in terms of the studies that Gene referred to about that there really isn't a big negative impact on wages for U.S. workers and so on. Eduardo Porter's work at the New York Times, he's done a lot of great kind of synthesis of those studies, particularly when he was writing the economics scene column. So for those who are interested in that issue, that's a good kind of source to check out.
Great. We have a veteran who was asking about encouraging all young adults to 1 year of military or AmeriCorps service to increase the general welfare of the nation and to help inspire greater equality and sense of service to one another. What are your thoughts, and what would you say to encourage the administration to explore this option?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your service. And I'm going to take this to a slightly broader level because I think it's important to the debate. There is so much debate in the economics world about will automation or robots reduce the number of jobs? And I just want to challenge that premise that someday we might not have enough jobs for workers. You might have less jobs in certain parts of the private sector with automation or robots. We'll see. but it doesn't mean we don't need more people in jobs that serve our country. That's what I call double dignity jobs. The ability for us to create more jobs that provide people with dignity, that they're treated with dignity in terms of their wages, their ability to move up and have careers, but they're doing it in the service of our country. And I think across our country, we have vast gaps. I mean, I'll just give you one example. I think some of the greatest heroes in our country are the parents of children who have a physical disability or autism. The level they go, not just to make sure their kid's okay, to make sure their kid thrives and is empowered and can contribute every way they can. But I don't want them to have to be such superheroes. Like, why do we not have support? Why do we, when we do have workers, pay them so little? The direct service professionals who make all the difference in a family's life. So what I want to say is we need this in our economy generally. Yes, for the reason that the questioner asked, to give people a sense of service, but also we need not only people to do a year, we need people to dedicate their careers more. And those are jobs that you need public support for in some way. So if we become a wealthier economy, but somehow through automation there's less jobs, don't say there's no jobs out there. Say now we can help create the jobs that allow us to be a caring society, to be a society where we serve each other and the nation as a whole, as this questioner has. That is my vision, and I think it's very important. And I think that after we recover, there probably is going to be a need for new types of jobs. Some jobs will not come back, and I think to help fill those with a sense of service or double dignity jobs, I would expect will be at a higher level of priority in 2021 than perhaps we've seen since President Clinton called for the AmeriCorps back in 1993.
Thank you. There are reports that China is considering dropping numerical GDP goals this year and opting instead for a more descriptive set of economic goals. Is this a good idea? And what are your thoughts about GDP as an economic measure more generally?
Boy, I'm really don't know that I want to, weigh in on, what China's doing as a good idea or bad idea. I think there's understandable concern about China's behavior to the United States and their fairness to us in trade, and whether they were completely transparent on, COVID. So I think there's a lot of questions there. But I think on GDP, obviously a premise of the book is to recognize that any metric is a proxy for the general welfare. So I use the example that, if Saudi Arabia has a high level of GDP, but they give it all to their royal family, or if we have GDP go up, but it goes all to the top 10th of 1%, that's not our goal. In other words, we judge GDP not on the assumption that it raises all boats, but whether it does in fact. So, I believe it is good to look at how we can have metrics that are more descriptive. People like Heather Boucher at the Center for Equitable Growth are working on a better form of GDP that measures how it's distributed. But the thing I want to suggest is growth can be very helpful to an economic dignity society, because if you're growing, there's there can be a higher standard of living. There can be more room for people to move up or immigrants to come in without moving other people out or giving them a smaller share. But it's not your ultimate goal. Your ultimate goal is the well-being of everybody, whether people have economic dignity. So you have to judge GDP not by whether it's 2%, 3%, or 4% alone, but whether that growth is helping to foster economic inequality, or whether it's is being used to foster a greater sense of economic dignity across all people.
Thank you. With the benefit of hindsight, how do you assess President Clinton's predictions about China's ascension to the World Trade Organization, especially its expected impact on American workers?
Well, President Clinton was, people might recall that in April of 1999, he did not take the deal, even when Zhu Rongji came over, and the business community was very upset about that. One of the reasons was that he was insisting on an anti-surge clause, which was Section 421. So he was trying to put in place a provision to ensure against those type of surges. And I believe had Al Gore been president, you would have had a very aggressive use of that and a very aggressive use against the, I think the flow of exports that came in. I think that one of the hard things in administration is you can put protections in, but you do have to, wonder, you have to recognize you may not be able to control the impact. I think the I think 2000 is, we all have to learn from that. That was a huge surge, and what, whether it was caused, by a particular trade agreement or just the, growth of countries in the global economy. I think you saw a diminishment of worker power, a capacity to fight for wages, and you saw communities get devastated with no response at all. You can't just say there's winners and losers, and that's what I mean. If we do not fix our compact, and I think on trade that means that you have to have worker focus at the table from the start. And I think what's been great about progressives now is they're now coming forward with a more progressive version, so that hopefully when there's a trade agreement, people aren't just relying on Republican votes. There'll be a more democratic vision, progressive vision, where worker interests are more paramount. And then hopefully we have that type of compact. But I do think that any of us who've seen the last 20 years have to say, in the absence of that type of compact, in the absence of negotiations that focus more on jobs and well-being in our economy, that perhaps till we get this right, we shouldn't go forward with new things that are going to cause this kind of disruption. We ought to have a standard for economic dignity for everyone, and not turn aside and say little things about winners and losers, which is easy to say if you're not the loser. Just like it's easy for people to say, let's open up the economy and people will die, which is pretty easy to say if those people aren't in your family and they're not your friends and they're not the people you love.
Thank you. Do you think there is now a serious risk of a worldwide depression?
In some ways, I was probably more scared at the beginning of 2009 that if you had another Lehman type of event, that you could have a complete freezing up, a kind of cycle that you can't get out. I mean, this is in some ways not as scary as that, but in other ways it is far more scary because you're shutting down the economy. And I guess the benefit that you have is that we do have a belief that if we invested in the 3 T's of testing and tracing and treatment, and that we ultimately got a vaccine, that there will be some form of end. But I do think that this is a place where doing the right thing from a humanitarian or dignity level is also the right thing from, and preventing that kind of economic, not just recession, but depression, which is that if we are committed to making whole our workers, if we're committed to 100% replacement or close to it when people are unemployed, or proposals to get companies to keep workers they would lay off, on their payroll with their health care, if we're willing to help the states who are going to be $500-600 billion short at no fault to their own, these things are not going to solve our crisis. This is a time where a crisis is going to be solved by a health solution, not ultimately an economic solution. And that's critical to understand. The question is, can we, through our economic power and might, and putting all the, ideology that says you don't want to help states out, which is crazy to me, or help people on unemployment have most of their paycheck paid. If you do those things, we're a more humane society, we're a more compassionate society, but we also will be helping to ensure that as we get a health solution, we can limit the amount of damage, not only to people, but the economy as a whole. But I will tell you, I think we will look back on this period terribly for decades to come, with the realization that there is no amount of money we could have spent, no amount of use of the Defense Production Act, no amount of emergency things you could have done to deal with the treatment, vaccines, PPE, testing, that would not have returned $20 on the dollar spent, no matter how big it seems right now.
Thank you. This one is on infrastructure. Why is it still on the back burner, even though the nation needs upgrades in all areas desperately, and nothing really has been done in 30 years? How much room is there now while Congress is willing to print a lot of money to add it to the virus stimulus legislation this summer?
You know, I can't predict whether it's going to make it into the, CARES Act 4.0 or 5.0. And of course, there are some issues about that until you have a healthy and safe economy, some of those things are of question. But I think that if you imagine a progressive agenda for a next administration, I think that you will have a different type of infrastructure. It will be focused not just on repairing roads and bridges, but building the sustainable future. It will be about having a more carbon neutral future, a more sustainable future. And so I think it's going to be very critical, because I think it will obviously create some stimulus for the economy. I think it will create a broader assortment of type of jobs, from innovation to home and school rehabilitation to normal construction jobs. But I think that it will almost fit into the gentleman's questions about service jobs. It will be more clear that these are now jobs that are part of serving the future of our country. And I really do believe that when you have a Democratic president, you will see a very green infrastructure type of proposal that I think will be a critical part of recovery when we've gotten as many of the jobs back that we can from a healthcare solution, a public solution.
One critical part of Gene's agenda he addresses at the end of the book, which I think is critical, is the need for training and education and upskilling workers. And, there's a real question around infrastructure, even if all of that were to pass, whether we have enough skilled tradespeople and others in the pipeline to actually get all that work done. And there are some potential real human capital shortages that we're going to pay for in that way, because we haven't done enough to invest in that kind of education and training. So it's also another important piece, I think.
Right. As Rick knows, what I have in the book is that I think there was a legitimate criticism that perhaps those of us in the Clinton administration, even though we were rightly calling for more investment in human capital, that it gave too many people the sense that you didn't have to worry about structural inequality or power imbalances or the rights and protections of workers. And what I say there is, you're right, but these are complements. This is a dynamic duo. So you need to focus more on worker power, but at the same time, you should also know that focusing on ensuring everybody can have the skills that they need shouldn't be seen in opposition. It should be seen as a complement. And one of the things I say in the book is that I would love to change the word college. I would love to get rid of this idea that college is one thing and a skilled or apprenticeship is something else, and instead say college means that after high school you have a path to pursuing your potential and your sense of purpose. And anything that fits that's of high quality, that we judge and we measure and we ensure is well done. And I think better and better public community colleges, expanding slots, should be what we call for as a country. And we shouldn't try to stigmatize some or label it some. Anything that is really your higher post-education should get the same type of support, the same type of respect. And I think if you have a green energy job, you're going to need jobs. Infrastructure package, you're going to need jobs across the spectrum to make that happen.
Thank you so much. And I think this will be our last question since we're almost out of time, but it's actually kind of two in one. COVID-19 has focused a spotlight on medical inequities and indignities. What can be done to encourage a more balanced system? Also, with 30 million people unemployed, what can be done to restore dignity and opportunity? And that'll be the final question.
So I could not agree more with the minority, African American, Latinx, leaders and advocates who want to make clear that what COVID is doing is shining a spotlight on existing inequities. Listen to what the environmental justice advocates have been saying for a long time. They're saying Flint is not the exception, it's the rule. And one of that is that people in lower income communities, often African American communities, have the least power most times to protect their environment and their air. If that means that you have because of that, which is a policy choice, you have more respiratory challenges for a certain amount of the community. It's not that COVID is having it's not just that COVID's having a disproportionate impact on those communities, it's that we already failed those communities. So, this is where you have to want universal health care. This is where what I said about a dignity wage becomes important. You want people not to go to work when they're sick. You want people not to community spread. Well, you have to have a system that allows them to take time off when they are sick or their children are sick. So I think that you can't solve the racial inequity of COVID alone. We can try to moderate it by recognizing how important it is to protect essential workers, to recognize how many of them are female and women, there are women of color, and that should inspire us more. But it really fits into the overall theme. This is only going to be our economic dignity moment if we both have a temporary response, and it inspires us in the way the Depression inspired the New Deal to have a new compact for economic dignity. And part of that has to be really putting front and center the racial disparities that are not just in health, though that's important, but go to worker safety and go to environmental justice across the country.
Great. Well, Gene, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to give you opportunity just for kind of a maybe last thought from you, and before we start to wrap up the program.
Well, I just appreciate being able to do this. One thing I just wanted to stress, that when I was thinking about a universal economic dignity standard, I was not trying to think about it in a utopian sense. I recognize that you can have policies that are beyond the potential. Not all of us are going to get to be Roger Federer or even get to write for the Wall Street Journal like Rick Wartzman or have all our dreams fulfilled. But if you look at what we're talking about here, it is so doable. To have a level of economic dignity, it does not mean getting rid of markets. It does not mean, it goes to how we structure our economy, how we structure markets. We can easily afford to have some vision of universal health care. We can easily afford to say that universal paid sick leave, universal family care is for everyone. We're seeing across the country that the minimum wage can be raised to $15 an hour, and that we've seen places where it's actually coincided with job growth. So this is an agenda and an aspiration for what we should be able to provide everyone. And I'll give you something that hits close to home. One of the things that has really affected a lot of upper middle class people is that because of COVID, we haven't been able to be with our parents in their last moments. And it's just heartbreaking. I don't know what economic number you put on that, but it's heartbreaking. It goes to our essence as a person to want to be there. And we suffer that and we say that's because of COVID. Well, guess what? If you're somebody who's working paycheck to paycheck that doesn't have $400 to your name, and your employer does not, your country, your state does not guarantee you comprehensive paid family time, then there are millions of people who haven't been by that bedside, who haven't been there. And if we think that's a dignity assault now, let's step back and ask where about all the assaults to economic dignity that happen every day to tens and tens of millions of the workers we say that are essential. And we should ask ourselves too, even before this, why did we not realize King's words of their value? When I look at the caregivers who have helped my father before he passed away, or with my mother in her final days, is there anything more important in your life than them, than what they're doing to care for your loved one? And so if you recognize that value and that dignity, then you have to start saying it's not okay that they're paid often 12, 13 an hour, that they've got no real career path, that they do not have universal health care. And individuals can help, they can pay people more, they can do great things, but ultimately this happens by us as a collective passing a set of laws that say, here's who we are, here's what our values are, and we're going to put them in practice post-pandemic and hopefully within the pandemic as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you really for such a great conversation, really important conversation, I think, especially at this time. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Again, please buy Gene's book. I think there's a link up now to make it one click away for you. So please go and do that. And I'm going to turn things back now to Kim McCleary to close us out.
Thank you both for a very moving and informative discussion. And Gene, I just ordered your book, so I expect everyone else to too, Economic Dignity. And thank you all for joining us on C by C, and please support your local World Affairs Council. You can check out more information on cbycamplified.com. Next week, we have a terrific program for you with former California Governor Jerry Brown, who will be talking about what he learned governing California, as well as his advice for U.S. governors who are facing the toughest decisions in their political careers. We also have politics in the time of coronavirus with Dan Schnurr. And May 18th, we discuss the potential end of the lockdown with Catherine Barger, our LA County Supervisor and Board Chair, and Dr. Barbara Farrar, Director of the LA County Department of Public Health. There's a little tab on the right-hand side of your screen that says handouts. Just click on that, and you can see all of our upcoming programs. Please register. Stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks again, Gene and Rick. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.